Okay, thank you very much, Rich and Jackie, for inviting me to this conference. And I thank everybody else who's still here, because when you're the last speaker on the schedule on a Saturday afternoon, you don't often know if you're going to be speaking to a full audience or 3 people. So I appreciate the fact that those of you stuck around. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators first off, which includes Rich and a number of my postdocs and graduate students. I'm going to be whizzing through these analyses very quickly today, but indeed, if people are interested in any of the specifics with respect to measures and statistical analyses, you can find it in this publication, which will be provided on the website. Now, one of the things that will probably become abundantly clear in a few seconds is I am not a mixed emotions researcher. Okay, I study children's development and family relationships, and Rich assured me that the talk that I was about to give today would indeed fit with the mixed emotions theme. Yesterday I sat and I listened very, very closely at the different theoretical and methods pieces, and there were a number of different points that really struck a chord with me. And these are verbatim, taken from people's talks. And I basically went home last night and took my developmental talk and sort of reworked it to make it more of a hopefully mixed emotions talk. But here are the different points that struck a chord with me yesterday. One was from Susan Charles, who said, context, context, context. I cannot emphasize this enough. Jeff Larson, who said, there are certain life events that are just filled with mixed emotions, and he gave the examples of moving out day at Ohio State and graduation day. And Rich pretty much said positive is always greater than negative when he was talking about how infrequent negative emotions really occur by themselves. So if you really want to understand them, you really need to understand them in the context of this mixed emotions with positive and negative together. And then at the very end, somebody asked in the audience, who I thought which was one of the most important questions, which is, why are mixed emotions even important? So I'm going to take each of these points and sort of talk a little bit about my work and how I see it fitting in. So context, context, context. The context that I'm going to be focusing on today are relationships as context, and particularly adult romantic relationships or attachment relationships in adulthood, as these are one of the most emotionally charged and important affective contexts of our daily lives. And the relationship that I'm really going to be focusing on today is the marital relationship, although it doesn't necessarily have to be a marital relationship, it's just these are the couples who are in my study. As with most marriages, they start like this, hopefully, although there was some implication yesterday that there may be a mixed emotion here with respect to the wedding. But in general, wedded bliss may indeed at some point give rise to something that looks like that. And once we make up, it looks again like this. But as time goes on, it could look again like this, again like this. Now hopefully what I'm trying to point out here and you're seeing is that marriages and partnerships are indeed a series of ups and downs and positive and negative emotions. So this state may eventually lead to something that looks like this, which may look to something like this. And if everything perhaps goes as planned, although many of these marriages within 5 years, 20% of them end, you might end up in a state like this. And if the family life cycle continues, something that looks like that, or the family develops. So this basically leads to my second point, which Jeff said, certain life events are just filled with mixed emotions, and I would claim that the birth of an infant and the transition to parenthood is one of those. Now, the study that I'm going to talk about today is the transition from the first to the second child, so the second-time mothers, that have been interviewed in earlier qualitative work have indeed confirmed that this is a period of mixed emotions. When interviewed, they will talk about the joy of having another child, about having the second child, what will make their family complete. But in the same breath, we'll also take note of things like, but I'm feeling really guilty, primarily because I'm worried I'm ruining my first child's life by having the second child that I'm actually looking forward to, but it will change things between me and my first child. I'm also concerned as to whether or not I can even have enough love for a second child like I do with my first child. So this is definitely a period of mixed emotions, at least based on the qualitative research that's out there. Now, We were talking during break about the replication crisis in psychology, but one area that there is no problem with in terms of replicating for at least the last 50 years is that one of the most consistent findings after the transition to parenthood is a decline in marital satisfaction or happiness after the birth of an infant. And meta-analyses have confirmed that this decline continues with each subsequent birth of a child. So often the unequal division of household and child care labor have been blamed for this decline because, well, one of the other findings we know is that once an infant is born, the division of labor in terms of who's doing what in the household, in terms of the husbands and wives, often becomes very traditional. And the notion is that women's violated expectations of equal division of labor have now been violated. They feel life is unfair and marriages decline. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the only reason, but this is one of the theories or hypotheses that are out there, and people seem to think that this change in division of labor does lead to violated expectations, feelings of unfairness, and potentially responsible for the decline. Now, marital relationship changes I'm trying to show here, however, because most of these studies are based on marital satisfaction, which is just basically an indicator of how happy somebody is. But changes in satisfaction can occur for a number of different reasons. Okay? One reason that changes in satisfaction could occur is because there's actually declines in actual patterns of communication or intimacy or the time spent together. Another reason that satisfaction might occur is because there's actually an increase in the negative. So there's actually an increase in fighting and arguing and disagreements over this period of time. And this, and from my perspective as somebody who studies marital change, and one of the reasons I designed the study in the first place, is important for targeting interventions. Because if decline is due to a decrease in positive, you may want to focus on increasing the positive, for instance, helping with communication patterns. But if it's really the decline is due to an increase in fighting, then perhaps you want to give the tools of basically being able to help learn how to resolve conflicts in a manner that doesn't lead to unhappiness. Whoops. So I'm going to talk today about the family transition study. Rich is involved in this study and has been involved with it for a long time. The goal of the study, this is a longitudinal investigation which was designed to examine changes in child and family function following the birth of a second child. It's a 5-time point longitudinal study that started in the prenatal time point within the last trimester of the mother's pregnancy with the second child, and we followed the families up at 1, 4, 8, and 12 months after the birth. These are just some of the sample characteristics. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but they were 241 two-parent families. On average, mothers were 32 years of age, fathers 33. They were married on average about 6 years. The older child was around 2.5, which is pretty standard and normative in the United States, and it is predominantly a European American, middle income, and educated sample. Now, the repeated measures were done at prenatal 1, 4, 8, and 12 months. We asked both husbands and wives during this period of time to fill out the Intimate Relationships Questionnaire. This questionnaire has 4 scales. They are intentionally designed to have 2 affect scales and 2 behavior scales. The love scale is pretty much a scale that tries to assess your feelings of love for one another, your sense of belongingness for one another, whether you feel attached to one another, whether you're intimate with one another. The ambivalence scale, we've talked about that a little bit. This scale is really trying to capture whether or not you feel ambivalent about staying in this relationship and being with this particular partner. The conflict scale is pretty self-explanatory. It pretty much is assessing how often or frequent you're arguing or disagreeing or having conflicts. And the maintenance scale is designed to assess whether or not you're actually putting effort forward to improve the quality of your relationship. So are actually you spending time together? Are you discussing the quality of your relationship and actually trying to improve it? Now, this scale has been used repeatedly in a number of studies of transition to parenthood. And so essentially what happens here is because the love and the maintenance scale are highly correlated and ambivalence and conflict are highly correlated, often they are composited into a positive marital relations and negative marital relations scale. So, Rich, positive is always greater than negative, or is it? So one of the things we find with the transition to parenthood in our data as well is that there are huge individual differences in terms of the trajectories, and this is what we have here is pretty much 25 randomly random individuals, random fathers who've been pulled from the sample, and we're showing essentially what their curves look like and their trajectories look like over the course of that year. Not only do they differ with respect to their intercepts and where they started, but hopefully, as you can see, that they're also they're changing differently over the course of this particular year. This is what we refer to as our adaptation and adjustment response. Somebody else has talked about resilience. We've also called it resilient. Why? Because the baby is born. In this particular case, positivity drops substantially, usually by 1 month of age, but by 4 months, it goes back to where it was before the birth, suggesting that there's been an adjustment period and an adaptation period back to where they were before. If this happens for negative relations, this is for positivity, we call it the honeymoon effect, because it's a period of a sudden drop or decline in negative interactions, but because, again, once again, it doesn't last very long and it bounces back to where it was before, the honeymoon is over. Okay. So most relationships may indeed have maybe more positive than negative, but some indeed may be more negative than positive. And I think one of the things we haven't really talked about in here is whether or not there's a balance, and if there's a sort of a set point or a tipping point in which positive and negative becomes, is there too much negative versus positive? And does this differ by individuals? So I consider this only because in the case of marital relationships, if you consider the fact that everybody starts out like that wedded, blissful couple, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So at some point, something has happened in these relationships to call it quits. Is it negative and positive affect? I don't know, but I think the question becomes, at some point, does there come a point where somebody says, this is the point of no return and I'm out of this relationship? There are mixed emotions in marital relationships, and there have been recent efforts in this literature on the transition to parenthood to identify groups of individuals who share common characteristics, or what we were calling a person-centered approach. In longitudinal data, we call it growth mixture modeling, and what we're trying to do is capture individual differences in these trajectory patterns within the sample. So can we identify groups of individuals who may share common trajectories over the course of this year? So what often happens is in these analyses is that somebody will take the positive scores for the wives, and they'll take the positive scores for the husbands. They'll do separate analyses. They'll come up with two groups of couples, one that's very high on positive trajectories, I shouldn't say couples, but wives, and another group that's low on positive. They'll do the same thing with the husbands, and they'll come up with a group that's high positive husbands and low positive husbands. So I guess the question I have to the group, is there any problem with this potential approach? My title sort of gave it away.
You
Yes.
have a high positive spouse of a low positive spouse.
Exactly. Not only does this analysis not really look at positive and negative together, it's just looking at positive separately, there's often, I think, assumptions that these high positive wives may be married to these high positive husbands, but there's no indeed guarantee that that's the case, okay, when you're analyzing them separately. So we are, a dyadic approach where you basically look at husbands and wives scores together with positive and negative. You might end up looking at couples where indeed in this particular, okay, I'm sorry folks. I need the red light. So what this is showing is basically a couple where they are both high on positive and they're both low on negative. So they're pretty tight together. They both sort of agree that their relationships are pretty much the same. So the affective experience for this couple is pretty similar. But down here what we have is that positive is also greater in both cases. But one spouse is really seeing things a bit differently than the other spouse. So here you have a husband who's really high on positive, really low on negative. But even though his wife is sort of high on positive and lower on negative, this difference is really not the same, suggesting that they may be seeing life a little bit different and they're discrepant in their experiences with respect to positive and negative affect in their relationships. So we did growth mixture modeling. We came up with different groups. I'm only going to really deal about the 4 today that I think are important to talk about. We found 2 groups of the very largest groups in our sample, and one I'm going to call the smooth transition group, and they look sort of like this over time. So what you see here is that husbands and wives are pretty close together in how they see their relationships in terms of high positivity, very low on negativity. This is actually what we call the honeymoon effect for these husbands. They actually experiencing somewhat of a drop by 1 month, but again goes back to the way it was before birth at 4. Women do report a slight decline in their positive relations over the course of the year, but in general, these couples, which make up 43% of our sample, seem to be doing pretty well over this transition. The next group we kind of refer to as the rocky transition, but still doing pretty well, I think. In general, they make up approximately 35% of the sample. Again, they're tight together in terms of positive and negative as a couple. Husbands here are actually experiencing a adaptation and adjustment response. There is a decline, but that goes back to the way it was. And wives here, why I call it a little bit more rocky, is because there's actually an increase in conflict over time while it remains stable for husbands. Now the next two groups are have a little bit more difficult and I think troubled transition. This is one of them. What you see here is the wives have a really significant decline and increase, so they were having a significant honeymoon effect, suggesting life is great, this baby's fantastic, whatever, but by 4 months, life is no longer peaches and cream. And not only is it peaches and cream, but this is really beginning to increase in terms of their divergence and how negative they're seeing things. And up here, also, wives are happier than their husbands are, but there's a fairly large discrepancy. This is not a lot of people, but as I'll show in a few minutes, or I have to basically say, this is a community-based sample, and I guess the question is how many difficult transitions or troubled families do we have to have in a sample in order for it to basically be real. This is our final group. What you see here is, of course, a huge discrepancy. Both spouses are having the honeymoon effect, but it is not lasting, and they're going back to basically the way life was before. There is an increase, and I think it's positive. These couples, the women actually report more negative in their marriages than they do positive, which is just really an unbelievably rare occurrence. It gets better over time. But even though you can't see all groups together, this positivity score doesn't come anywhere near the positivity score of the other groups, suggesting that even with an improvement over time, these couples are still not reporting as much positivity in their relationships. So the other question we had is, can we find differences across the groups that might explain these different relationship patterns? So what we did is we just looked to see if there were differences at the prenatal time point before the baby was even born that might help explain how these relationships got to where they were over the course of the year. And the answer is yes, we can. When we looked at the prenatal differences on a number of different indicators, what we found is in general that the couples that were in those last two groups, both spouses reported more depression and had higher necroticism scores, but it was particularly the case for the mothers. The pregnancies were more likely to be unplanned in those particular families. The couples also reported more marital dissatisfaction before the baby was born. And the division of child care, as I mentioned, has been seen as a really important factor in determining whether or not couples are experiencing declines. The division of child care and who was doing what, whether husbands were involved or not, did not make any difference whatsoever. What made a difference is we asked the couples, when you disagree on child care, which of the following things do you do to solve your problems? And you can divide those things into marital communication scales. One is a destructive marital communication scale, and one is a constructive marital communication scale. Destructive communications are yelling, screaming, blaming each other, threatening each other, calling each other names, and of course constructive marital communication is using the things that marital communication experts say, reflective listening, sitting down having discussions, trying to do problem solving, taking the perspective of one another. Those destructive patterns are the types of marital communication patterns that the last two groups were more likely to be using to solve their issues with respect to child care. So again, it was the positive and negative affect and marital communication patterns that seem to be discriminating these two groups. And the last question is, why are mixed emotions important? This is my answer to this particular question. It may be different for others. In my world, children are living in these families. And postpartum maternal depression is a major risk factor for the development of infant emotion dysregulation and insecure mother-infant attachments, which are in their own right a risk factor for the development of childhood psychopathology. An open marital conflict of the destructive sort in front of children is a major risk factor for the development of childhood psychopathology. So mixed emotions are important in my world because of its effects on children. So thank you.